November 25th, 2021. The proceedings will be made available via the House of Commons website. So you are aware, the webcast will always show the person who's speaking rather than the entirety of the committee. As we know, no screenshots or photos are permitted during the proceedings. And of course, for those in the room, let's make sure that we're being mindful of the health protocols that are established by the Board of Internal Economy. Certainly look forward to welcoming our guests and just for your benefit in terms of, I believe you are all in the room, so it's exciting to have you back. Just in terms of language, you can toggle between English and French in terms of the headset in front of you. Pursuant to Standing Order 108 Sub 2 and the motion adopted by the committee on Monday, January 31st, 2022, the committee is resuming its study of the environmental contribution of agriculture. I'd like to welcome our first panel today. Joining us in person, Susie Miller, Executive Director of the Canadian Roundtable for Sustainable Crop. Aaron Gowrick, who is the Executive Director of Grain Growers of Canada. Welcome back. And Fawn Jackson, who is the Director of Policy and International Affairs with the Canadian Cattlemen's Association. I also have Dwayne Thompson, who is the Chair of the Environment Committee for the Canadian Cattlemen's Association. So each of our organizations will have 5 minutes for opening remarks. Colleagues, one thing I just wanted to highlight is there is a possibility of a potential procedural vote this morning. If you'll indulge me, I was wondering if we might be able to get unanimous consent that if the bells do start for whatever reason, you can give me discretion to get us closer down so we can continue our work.
Mr. Chair, if I may,
Yep.
I believe there are a number of us that would prefer to vote in the House, so if we could have enough time that we could get back to the House, that would be appreciated.
Okay, I think the establishment by the House, by our whips, is 15 minutes. So when the bells do ring, Mr. Epp, is it okay that we wait till about 15 minutes before the vote and then I would release us?
That'll be fine, thanks.
Okay, thanks. Thank you, everyone. Okay, so we'll move forward with opening statements by our witnesses. We have Ms. Miller, I believe, first up for me. You have 5 minutes. Over to you.
Thank you. And thank you so much for the opportunity to appear before you and actually in person. It feels good. I'm Susie Miller, the Executive Director of the Canadian Roundtable for Sustainable Crops, and we're an organization that is committed to pursuing opportunities and meeting the challenges of the sustainability of the production of cereals, oilseeds, and pulses in Canada. And our members are grain farm organizations, input suppliers, grain marketers, food companies, conservation associations, and researchers. So we cover all of the stakeholders. You've already received an extensive amount of excellent advice. So rather than repeating that, I thought I could focus my remarks on what grain farmers told us about sustainability, the challenges and the opportunities. We conducted conversations with them in spring last year, winter last year, and winter this year. We talked to over 600 individual farmers. So what they're saying is, first and foremost, they want to be recognized for their contributions to climate solutions, actions that they've taken and continue to take to reduce greenhouse gas emissions on their farm and sequester carbon in their soil. They feel somewhat that they're the villain, and they see themselves more like heroes. Good environmental practices like soil health have always been important to crop farmers, and they're proud of the work that they do and want to be seen as professionals that have the expertise to undertake the right decisions. They've told us there are many ways to reach the end goals of soil health and GHG emission reduction. It's important for them, for government, but also their customers, not to arbitrarily dismiss certain practices as inadequate or favor one practice over the other, or select a specific practice as the solution. They want their ways of reaching the end goal should be based on science, and they want the calculation of the cost and benefits and impacts on them. Research is critical, not only to identify best practices, but how to limit risks of implementing new practices. And they express that new and improved technology can help them where they want to go. They also told us, and I'm sure you've heard this before, the differences between regions and farms must be recognized. One size does not fit all is something we heard quite frequently. And an example that they raise quite often is where no-till is a beneficial practice in Western Canada. It can be more challenging in Eastern Canada in wetter climates, and that cover crops, for example, are challenging when the ground is frozen by the time that you harvest. Farmers have also told us that modern farming practice and wildlife can and do coexist. And when it comes to nature-based solutions, they see some significant cost or lost revenue that can conflict with their risk management and viability goals. So they would like to see these costs quantified and considered when supporting nature-based solutions. But they express most of all that they really do want to contribute. They feel they are already, but they want to contribute more. But they see a potential conflict, but more like trade-offs between various priorities of the Government of Canada, the people of Canada, that implicate them: reducing greenhouse gas emissions from farms, increasing the feedstock for renewable fuels, Canada's contribution to world food security, and the farm sector's contribution to the economic growth. They're not certain how they can help meet all of those at the same time. They see that the market, they would like changes in the market that does not value the contribution that they're making to climate solutions, nor consider the investments that farmers have to make. They worry about the loss of their ability to use modern farming practices that help them improve soil health and sequester carbon. They fear, as I'm sure you're aware, of additional regulations or targets that arbitrarily imposed from their perspective without due consideration of their ability to meet them. But most of all, they want to be an active partner with governments and customers in determining the best way to make their contribution to climate change mitigation. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Miller. Right on time. Ms. Gawryluk, over to you for grain growers for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and to the committee members for the invitation to address all of you today on this topic of importance to farmers, to Canadians, and to the world. It is very nice to have the opportunity to see many of your faces now in person. Thank you for that. My name is Erin Gawryluk, and I'm the Executive Director of the Grain Growers of Canada, a national association which represents the interests of about 65,000 grain, pulse, and oilseed farmers in every province across the country. As the voice of Canada's grain farmers, I would like to stress that our members view their relationship to the land as paramount. It is their livelihood that depends on it. Leaving healthy and sustainable environment for future generations is what farming is all about. And today I'm proud to be able to share that story with all of you. In anticipation of my appearance here today, I reached out to our members with an invitation to share their sustainability story, along with some concrete examples of methods and practices that they have used to increase productivity on their operations while protecting their viability. And our members responded resoundingly and with enthusiasm. First and foremost, many of our members pointed to the significant research investments that farmers directly have made to improve the sector's environmental contributions. Long before any significant political pressure or policy mandates, farmers invested in sound science aimed at reducing both emissions as well as their carbon footprint. The reason for this is simple. It just makes sense. In fact, our member associations have invested millions into establishing best practices in fertilizer management so that the best possible crop yields can be achieved while minimizing the crucial inputs needed to grow them. Investments in research like this make business sense, just as much as they help the environment. When expensive nitrogen, for example, is lost to the atmosphere or misapplied, it also impacts a farmer's already razor-thin margins. But the innovation does not stop there. There have also been significant investments made into research on how to use nitrogen more efficiently and how to modify genetics to allow the plant to fix its own nitrogen. This has been coupled with research on how to reduce herbicide and insecticide use, all while making the plant itself more responsive and less impactful on its own ecosystem. While this important research continues, Canadian farmers have also been on the cutting edge with their on-farm practices to ensure the farm is efficient, profitable, and sustainable. Among the many practices that were shared with me, I would like to highlight a few critical ones, including the adoption of variable rate technology or precision agriculture to optimize the use of seed, fertilizer, and crop protection products, the adoption of new 3-tier and 4-tier diesel engines and tractors, as well as the use of GPS technology to prevent field overlap, reducing the amount of fuel that is used. And of course, as Susie mentioned, the widespread adoption of conservation tillage, which creates a carbon sink while increasing organic matter in the soil. For any of the committee members who have not yet had a chance to visit a farm that has embraced these technologies, I would encourage you to do so. It is really remarkable technology that has had an incredible environmental impact on Canadian farms across the country. And I would be remiss if I did not thank you too, Mr. Chair, for visiting Saskatchewan to do just that. The reason I mention all of these is not to say that further progress cannot be achieved. Canada's grain farmers are consistently looking for the most efficient way forward. While many of these practices have come at a cost to producers, they were adopted voluntarily, in the absence of any regulatory requirement to do so. And that is why it is so important that we do not lose sight of the economic viability of Canadian farms. No matter where you farm in this country, you are operating on increasingly narrower margins. In fact, this year, many Canadian farmers will be planting what is likely their most expensive crop. Consider the unprecedented cost of fuel, fertilizer, and crop protection products, and the global and environmental uncertainty facing thousands of grain farmers still recovering from last year's devastating drought. To meet government and industry targets, farmers will need to continue to invest in their operations and new technologies and equipment that will make them more efficient. Farmers will make these investments when they're confident in the economic stability and sustainability of their operations. Governments can help facilitate this by ensuring that farmers have access to predictable and reliable risk management programs like Agri-Invest and Agri-Stability. Another way to encourage farmers to invest in new technologies and practices is by supporting Bill C-234, by providing relief from carbon pricing on natural gas and propane used to dry grain. Rebates will not make up for the costs incurred by carbon pricing. Grain farmers are prepared to do more, as evidenced by their track record, and that is why on March 28th of this year, the Grain Growers of Canada announced the creation of a Climate Solutions Initiative to help meet Canada's ambitious goal of net zero emissions by 2050. The Road to 2050 will propose a path forward that focuses on innovation, research, and beneficial management practices. This will boost productivity while continuing to enhance soil quality, improving the carbon sequestration potential of cropland, and reducing emissions. We believe that a united approach to climate change is the strongest way forward, and rest assured, Canadian grain farmers are ready to do their part. With our policymakers and legislators as key partners, we are prepared to produce even more food while we support a growing population. Thank you for your time today. I'll be happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Thank you very much, Ms. Gowruck. We're now going to turn to the Canadian Cattlemen's Association. Ms. Jackson and Mr. Thompson, you guys have 5 minutes collectively. Over to you.
Well, good morning, and thank you for the opportunity to appear before this committee. My name is Dwayne Thompson, a beef and crop producer from Saskatchewan, and the chair of the Canadian Cattle Association's Environment Committee. I'm pleased to have CCA's staff person, Vaughn Jackson, with me today. Last time we presented to the committee, we discussed the beef industry's contribution to the environmental outcomes and outlined our robust 2030 goals. As part of the discussion, we outlined the 44 million acres of grassland under the stewardship of Canadian beef producers and how we are losing this at-risk ecosystem at astonishing rates. With this in mind, we would like to do a deeper dive into the land use with the agriculture sector, as it's the highest correlating factor to our ability to deliver on our shared environmental commitments, including climate change and biodiversity, amongst others. Analysis by the Nature Conservancy of Canada shows that on average, over the past 25 years, roughly 148,000 acres of temperate native grasslands have been lost through conversion each year. This doesn't include the tame pastures and haylands, which also are being lost and in fact, a recent study by Nature United identified stopping this loss as the #1 solution we have for nature climate solutions. And so naturally, we have to ask, why did this happen? And what do we need to do to turn this around? There are several reasons why we saw this change and shift in agriculture use. Of course, the beef industry has had its economic challenges in the past, particularly in the early 2000s following BSE. We saw a large economic impact that led to a large land use change that were felt for many years following. However, today, despite the beef industry being in a much stronger position economically in comparison to the BSE days, we continue to see loss of grasslands directly correlated to the shrinking cow herd. One of the key factors is that beef industry has less ability to manage risk associated with our sector in comparison to cropping sector. For example, on our farm, we have more effective tools to manage our crop risks than we do our beef risks. And furthermore, our crop insurance is a cost-shared premium, where our beef insurance is not. And this is extremely important to our young producers and families. These factors lead to business decisions where farmers and ranchers convert land from pastures to cropland, or perhaps sell for other purposes. Today, with the demand on biofuels and crop prices as they are, there are further economic reasons for people to consider switching land use. Of course, in some cases, it might make sense to switch land use, and we certainly want to leave it up to our private landholders to be able to make those decisions. However, we, along with our conservation partners, as you've previously heard, understand the immense environmental value that goes with keeping grasslands in production in Canada, such as carbon sequestration and immense biodiversity, including our species at risk. We would suggest that development and adoption of a comprehensive land use strategy by all the levels of government and stakeholders to strike a balance between the urban expansion, agriculture production, and environmental protection. There are also further goals that we would like to we see as helpful to maintain grasslands, such as natural perennial forage conversion program, investments in term easements, enhancement of funding for programs that support best management practices, or programs that reward producers for carbon sequestration and biodiversity, water and wetland conservation. In the beef industry, along with the robust membership of the Canadian Roundtable for Sustainable Beef, we have ambitious 2030 goals, including maintaining 35 million acres of native grasslands and sequestering an additional 3.4 million tons of carbon every year. These efforts, combined with our work to reduce our greenhouse gas intensity footprint by 33% by 2020 or 2030s, which I would note is certainly on the right track with exciting new feed additives, as mentioned by the CRSB at their committee appearance, have us excited about both the environmental and economic future of the Canadian beef industry. We in the beef industry are proud to be one of Canada's largest agriculture sectors, supporting 348,000 jobs, contributing to $21.8 billion to the GDP, while conserving 44 million acres of the important grassland ecosystem that stores 1.5 billion tons of carbon. We have much to offer both to the Canadian economy and our environmental commitments, and we look forward to working with you on these shared goals. Thank you very much for having us today, and we look forward to having questions.
Thank you, Mr. Thompson. And we're going to move right to questions. So first up, we have Mr. Epp for 6 minutes. Mr. Epp, over to you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to our witnesses for your excellent testimony. I'm going to pose a question or a series of questions and ask all three of you to respond. I'm going to pick up from a comment from Ms. Gowerlich, where you identified all of the practices that have come already voluntarily. And the emphasis here is voluntary. I've heard the term in my previous about cross-compliance. There are goals, environmental goals that each of you have articulated. The government's articulated some. So my questions are, in your testimony here, we hear you. Do you feel in your engagement with AAFC, with ECCC, do you feel you've been heard? And what would be your comments on a linkage, because we are moving into the year where we're negotiating the cap going forward. What are your comments on cross-linking environmental goals and BRM goals? Let's begin maybe with grain growers, please.
Certainly. Thank you very much for the question, Mr. Epp. I think with response to the first part of your question in terms of whether or not we feel we've been heard, I think that we wanted to be seen, grain growers across the country wanted to be seen as active participants in this important discussion. And that's why we made the announcement we did on March 28th on the road to 2050. That's our way of saying that we can be a solutions provider and want to work closely with our government partners to ensure that the policies and programs that are developed in this space reflect the best interests of Canadian grain farmers. At the same time, too, we want to ensure that they're practical and they can be applied, because to Ms. Miller's point, some of those practices or the programs that are currently being funded don't necessarily make sense on farms across the country. And so this is our way of saying that we're going to have some solid recommendations with respect to what you can expect from Canadian grain farmers, and we want to be a part of those discussions. And I think with respect to the second part of your question on cross-compliance, we think it's really important that while we're having this conversation about what more Canadian farmers can and are willing to do in this space with respect to their environmental contributions, that's critical. We don't want to see that become criteria to or a barrier to entry with respect to the risk management programs that are so fundamentally critical to Canadian farmers across the country, especially at a time when they're facing unprecedented risks.
Thank you. Ms. Miller?
Just to add a small amount to what Aaron provided you, I think what we see from the industry sector is that there are many pressures on the Environment Canada, Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada, and that it is challenging to balance them all. And a lot of things have come very suddenly and haven't allowed the type of discussion that we would prefer. But what we see is attempts at being open and inclusive and allowing us to participate.
I'll ask the cattle folks, please.
Oh, Dwayne, you're on mute.
Sorry about that. I'd like to speak to the cross-compliance part of the question first. The cross-compliance is a challenge because in this industry, agriculture is a system. And I think some of the unintended consequences of having cross-compliance across programs is that producers don't have the flexibility to optimize their system. And by having cross-compliance, I feel that people might manage according to programs rather than optimizing the system, which can directly affect the environment and the system and the production system that we operate in, because it's such a wide variety of production systems, even within the beef sector, but never mind when you mix it into cropping and a mixed operation.
Thank you very much. Getting into a bit more specifics to Ms. Gowrick, gene editing. Can you describe the huge advantages, at least from my perspective, that a rapid adoption of that technology could potentially bring, both environmentally and economically?
Certainly, I think with respect to gene editing and other similar tools around modern agriculture, I think increasingly now, especially around climate change, we need to ensure that Canadian farmers have the tools in their toolbox to address the situations and the challenges that they're facing increasingly now as a result of climate change. Gene editing is just one example of the many tools available to mitigate some of those risks. And one example I would provide of that would be more recently with respect to the widespread drought that we saw across Western Canada. If you're looking at gene-edited drought-tolerant varieties, for example, more investment needs to be made in that space, and quite frankly, a regulatory framework to allow the development of those products to reach market so that Canadian farmers are better prepared to mitigate some of the challenges they're facing with climate change with some of those new varieties.
A follow-up question to that, do you think layering on another layer of oversight at PMRA will speed or hinder that process?
I'll go back to something that Ms. Miller said with respect to her comments around what she's hearing from Canadian farmers, and that is collectively we want to see that all regulatory frameworks are developed with science in mind. This government talks a lot about the importance of science-based, evidence-based policy, and I think it's really important that while we have that conversation, we walk the talk.
Mr. Chair, I'm going to cede the rest of my time and bank it for the next time.
Okay, we'll keep that in mind. We'll go to Mr. Lewis now for 6 minutes.
Chair and Mr. Epp, I didn't know that you could do that. They can do this thing. We have a seed bank here. Thank you for our witnesses, both virtually and for in person, for being here. I was taking notes feverishly. Maybe I would start with Ms. Miller from the Canadian Roundtable for Sustainable Crops. You touched on best practices, the ways of limiting risk. And at the same time, you also touched on that one size does not fit all. You said that no-till in the West is easier than the East. You said cover crops are harder if the ground freezes. So what is that balance? How can we strike that balance that we can have best practices shared, but at the same time focus on regional? What are those challenges and what are the solutions that you're doing?
I think from the perspective of the farmers that we talked to, it was about outcomes. Tell us what you want, and we'll figure it out. It's not quite as simple as that, of course. It requires the research, the practical application, and the farm is a whole unit. It's not one particular practice or another. And in many cases, like Mr. Thompson's, for example, it does include both livestock and crops. That needs to be balanced. So it's about flexibility and understanding that there is a capacity among the farmers themselves to make a right decision if you have the appropriate information available.
Okay, thank you. Now, maybe I will then skip to Mr. Thompson, because you did touch on, as I was saying it, where was it? Sorry. The goals for 2030. You said 35 million acres preserved for grasslands. And we talked about that ecosystem as both sequestering carbon and promoting biodiversity. So 2030, are you working backwards for that? Can we help you get to 2030? What can we do to help preserve that grassland for carbon sequestration and for biodiversity?
Well, I think you have a good understanding of the fact that the grassland is such an important ecosystem and provides so much value to the greater economy and society in general. And number one, we have to figure out a way to promote the stabilization and the conversion from further conversion, because as I mentioned, we're losing it at an alarming rate. And so if we could have programs that perhaps show the value of the carbon sequestration that's happening on those grasslands, and then producers like myself can look at that and say, rather than seeding that piece of land that might not grow the best canola, I could leave it in forages and make it that it was value that carbon, then and not promote the grain farming side of my operations for me to do that. Because if that happens, we would take the forages out, which would be a huge carbon release, which would happen on the natural lands as well. So we have to have ways and programming that can effectively support and promote grasslands that should be maintained in grasslands, and it just like the crop insurance and the shared premium, that would be huge, especially for our young producers, to support grasslands and beef production.
And are you already able to measure, quantify carbon sequestration, and who are you working with in that case? That's one of the things we want to learn moving forward. How can we measure those numbers so we can compensate and reward for them?
Well, you've asked one of my pet things. The quantification of carbon and optimizing our system and optimizing the practices is really an important thing. And no, I think the answer is no. We're not at the point where we can quantify it effectively. And I really hesitate to promote best management practices on a value base. But I would suggest that best management practices can be suggested, but then to encourage a quantification of carbon sequestration, and that way everybody in their system on their operations can say, this is what I can do for my finances and the environment, and come out in a economical balance and promote the two together. And so there is the Food and Water Wellness Foundation is doing great work on quantification, and it looks like they're coming up with quite a financially viable way of doing it. So I would suggest we're working towards it, but we're not there yet.
If I could just add in, Dwayne, is that, I think we're working on the finer details of the quantification. So we do know that there's about 1.5 billion tons of carbon within the grasslands that are managed by beef producers. But when we go to add even more carbon through best management practices, there's further research to be done there to get it to a little bit finer details. So, but we do know that when lands are converted, if it's converted into a cityscape or if it's converted into some other agricultural use, we know that about 30 to 40% of the carbon is lost when it's converted. So just wanted to add.
Can I just add one more thing, please? By not promoting and not encouraging people to optimize their system on the grasslands that they manage right now, and if we develop programs that encourage new practices and people who have been doing it a long time, we have to be very careful that we don't develop programs that encourage people like me to do something new because I can do something new in 2 years. We could take forages out and put them back into forages. And so we have to make sure that producers that have been managing well-managed, environmentally sustainable systems aren't discouraged from continuing that.
Thank you, Mr. Thompson. Thank you, Mr. Lewis. We're at time, unfortunately. But maintenant, Monsieur Parent, pour 6 minutes, s'il vous plaît.
Mr. Parent, please. Yes, thank you very much, Chair. Good morning to the witnesses, and thank you for being with us today. Your testimony has been very valuable. Mr. Thompson, I'd like to let you actually continue talking about what you were saying earlier. You were saying that it's important for people who are already using best practices, who are already running sustainable farms, it's important for them not to be discouraged from continuing. So do you think that there might be a way where we could actually evaluate the current effectiveness of some farms? In previous panels, you said you didn't have great ways of measuring carbon right now, but other witnesses have told us that technology is advancing quickly, and maybe we could get there pretty quickly. So is there any way of measuring the current state of people's lands and really getting a picture of how different farms are performing? Would that help meet your objective?
Absolutely. I think that's a key point. And I think that is, and I think the technology, we're getting very close. I understand in the States there's some infrared type technology, and they do a balance of organic growth and some soil sampling, and then they can do it from satellite imagery, and they're also doing it with, as I mentioned, the Food and Water Wellness Foundation are getting some very good results and feeling pretty comfortable with the results they're getting. And of course, that has to be cost effective. They can't have people out punching soil samples and it being burdensome. And at the end of the day, we have to have it cost effective, because if we have producers are encouraged to do these environmental impact and be sustainable, and we can quantify our carbon levels at an economic level, then we have to be able to be the major benefactor of it. We can't have the aggregators and all the system taking the lion's share. And if we can be the benefactors of these environmental sustainable practices and show the results that we have, and on our farm alone, we've have land that we're almost triple the average organic matter. And that's a key factor in sustainability and so many things that go with that. So yes, we have to work towards that research.
So you would recommend to the committee that we should consider, what's been done in the past, and then, of course, you said a lot of really interesting things here, but you mentioned notably that it has to be cost effective. So would you recommend to the committee that this system be decentralized so that it not actually fall under a single program dictated by the federal government, but that it be treated more on a case-by-case basis, where we can look at the regional situation, the local situation, and look at the ecological performance of the soil, and then later measure the performance, the improvement, and quantify that in some way? Also, I'm just going to give you my personal opinion here. You can tell me if you agree. To me, it's kind of like a new agriculture investment program, like sums of money that would be made available directly to farmers, and then you could use that money to invest in future innovation, right? The next sustainable innovation and the next thing that will allow you to improve your performance. And then we'll just continue to, give you guys the money to do what you need to do, but always in a decentralized fashion. Does that make sense to you?
I think you and I have a lot that we could talk about in common.
Bonne réponse.
It certainly is important that
A good answer.
put on a regional basis because regionality, even in Saskatchewan, production systems there's such an incredible diversity of what landowners are managing. And so you're dead on. You're absolutely right that we cannot do it on a broad spectrum. We have to do it on a more local, more geographical area, if you may. And I like the idea of what you're saying as a potential investment, because farmers are the original environmentalists. Our very existence depends on it. I'm fourth generation. My kids are fifth generation. I've got grandchildren who are sixth generation. It's in my very best interest to be an
Thompson, je m'excuse de vous couper, on s'entend.
I'm sorry to cut you off. I think we really agree here, and I'd love to hear you talk forever about it. But I also want to hear the other witnesses maybe talk on that same point before my time runs out. Do you have anything to say? Do you think that a system like this should be decentralized?
Opportunities and room for both. One of the things that we did 2 years ago, we had the University of Alberta look at the literature that was out there, the research that had been done that could show the impact of different practices on a grain farmer's carbon output, carbon footprint. There was nothing. So I certainly, in terms of farm practices, there has to be the basis of good science, which is very challenging to do farm by farm by farm, or even region by region. When it comes to the proofing those practices, demonstrating those practices, and implementing those practices, absolutely. Farmers have told us that it has to be responsive to their needs, and a region isn't necessarily a province. There are differences within, as Wayne indicated.
Thank you,
Mr. Thompson.
Thank you, Ms. Miller. Thank you, Mr. Perron. I'm sorry we're at time. I'm going to move to Mr. McGregor for 6 minutes now.
Great. Thank you very much, Chair. And thank you to all of our witnesses. I'm going to ask a question. I'd like to hear from each of you in response. So in Australia, there are efforts well underway right now to implement a national soil strategy. It's going to set out how that country values, manages, and improves its soil for the next 20 years. And I like comparing Canada and Australia because, of course, we're both Commonwealth countries. We both have very similar systems of government with their capital in Canberra. Their state governments have similar devolution of powers that our provinces have. But this is really a huge undertaking. They have done it through consultation with many different stakeholders. They want to make sure that it is prioritizing soil health, that it is empowering soil innovation and stewards, that it's going to strengthen soil knowledge and capability. So maybe, Ms. Scourlock, I'll start with you. What are your thoughts on Australia's efforts in this regard? And do you think Canada could benefit from implementing a similar strategy where we really reach out to stakeholders so that we are having a united federal effort at recognizing this being one of our most valuable resources?
Thank you very much for the question, Mr. McGregor. I'm not familiar with the strategy itself, but based on what you told me about it today, I think that it's definitely something worth exploring. But I think to your last point, I think it's critical that anytime we look at a strategy like this, that Canadian farmers across the country are a part of the discussion. So I think they would welcome the opportunity to do that. And I think that's part of what we intended to do or are intending to do with the Grain Growers of Canada roadmap to net zero by 2050. That is to have a national discussion with grain farmers across the country on areas where we have greater potential, and we know we can do more. To identify those areas, provide some solid recommendations to the government, and work closely with our government partners to ensure that policies and programs reflect the best interests of Canadian farmers. And I think this is one area that we'll certainly be exploring as part of that discussion.
Thank you. Ms. Miller?
Directly to your question, I would answer yes. The Soil Conservation Council of Canada and the Compost Council of Canada have recently published a roadmap to soil improvement. And there's a lot of research going on, but to try to work together, even to understand where the opportunities for improvement are, I think is an excellent idea, and it is certainly something in the farmers that we talk to, they would be very, very interested in participating.
Thank you. And to the Canadian cattlemen, please.
Yeah, I think it would be a great idea. I'm not familiar with the Australian program, but back to our own history, even my dad was part of the SOS program, Save Our Soils, back in the early 80s. And, as farmers we've made really great strides since then. So the dirt is our very existence. And so a national soil strategy would be a very good thing. And I think we could, as Canadian cattle producers, could be a very important component of that.
Well, there is a certain private members bill, C-203, that you might all be interested in looking at for further research. So thank you for each of your answers on that. I'd like to turn to the Canadian cattlemen. Your organization on your website, you've got an article posted there from February 22nd titled "Curbing Methane Emissions Will Take a Team Effort." And you go on, it's in-depth approach on the different feed additives that are under development at trying to reduce methane emissions from ruminants, from dairy and from beef cattle. We also know that there is potentially promising research out there with the development of different genetic stocks and so on, which could provide some steeper long-term decreases in methane emissions. When you look at the research, and I know research takes a lot of time to get it right, but when you look at the progress of research both in developing those feed additives, their approval for commercial use, but also the different genetics bloodlines that may also yield some incredible results. Are you happy with the way that research is progressing? And if there's any room for improvement, is there anything that our committee could specifically be recommending to the federal government on aiding that research even further? Does the federal government need to pay more attention to funding that research because of the potential that it may yield in terms of an absolute reduction in our methane emissions?
Fawn, you're very well versed in this. Could you take that one?
Sure. Yeah. First of all, I would say that Canada has 50% of the greenhouse gas footprint of the global world average. And the reason that we have that is because we've, for a long time, invested in research. And some of the research around 3-NOP, which is one of these feed additives that you're alluding to, one of the biggest studies was done in Canada, which indicates that around 70 to 80% of emissions may actually be able to be reduced. So, we know that research works, and we also know that we have to invest in it for a really long time. And so these are the, foundations of all of our environmental work that we need to make sure that we are not getting distracted by shiny stars over here and turning away from things that we know long-term deliver. So for us, A-based research is going to be very key to continue to invest in to make sure that we have these tools continuing to be developed, because it takes a long time to develop them. Thanks for that question.
Thank you, Ms. Jackson. Thank you, Mr. McGregor. We'll go back to our 5-minute question period. Ahead, Mr. Lew, but maybe Mr. Epp is going to be ceding a little bit more time. So over to you guys.
Take more.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for the witnesses for being here. I have a question for Mrs. Goverluck. I'm sorry, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing your name correctly. In the PBO report, it said that for 2030, when the carbon tax will have reached $170, that it would have no more impact on greenhouse gas emissions. Do you agree with this statement from the PBO? And Secondly, the fact that we could reimburse this money with regards to, rather remove this for propane or natural gas, what would be the difference for you with regards to the taxes? What is your point of view on this?
Thank you very much, Mr. Luhu, for the question. I think with respect to the first part of your question, I think we have to bear in mind that the carbon tax is applied to natural gas and propane used for drying grain. At this point right now, farmers have no alternative but to use fossil fuels. And that's why we continue to support the passage of the private member's bill C-234. I think that there's acknowledgement from this government that the policy objective intended with that particular policy is not achieving its goal. And to your second point with respect to developing this rebate program that was established, because I think ultimately the intention of the rebate was to return 100% of the funds that were ultimately collected from Canadian farmers and ranchers back to Canadian farmers and ranchers. But what we've seen happening is that while all of that money may be going out the door, it's not equitable in terms of its approach to distribution. And so some of our directors have quantified what they're going to be getting back in the form of a rebate. And in some cases, it's still below 40% of what they ultimately paid in carbon taxes that they'll be getting back in the form of a rebate. So I think there's acknowledgement from this government that the tax that's being applied is not fair and it's not ultimately reaching its intended objective. And so that's why our sector continues to support the passage of Bill C-234 as the most efficient way to ensure that Canadian grain farmers who have no alternative but to use natural gas and propane to dry their grain do so at no additional cost, especially when you consider all of the unprecedented costs that they're currently facing.
Merci. Dans la même...
Thank you. Follow-up question as to nitrogen. If we talk about the different programs of support programs from the federal government, are they adequate or for nitrogen additive feed? Should these programs be improved upon or are they adequate?
I think that that's part of what we're going to be looking to do as part of our roadmap to 2050 and this initiative that's currently underway with the Grain Growers of Canada. We want to ensure, to Ms. Miller's point, that as a national association we have an opportunity to have a national conversation to ensure that the programs and the funding that Canadian farmers have access to makes sense in Western Canada just as much as it does in Eastern Canada, for example. And so I think that's why it's important that we're having a national conversation to ensure that the right dollars are being directed to the right policies and programs so that Canadian farmers can take advantage of those.
Merci.
Thank you. For Mr. Thompson now, with regards to research and this dynamic of incorporating additives to feed, do you think that the federal government right now is playing the role that they should to support businesses with regards to production?
I think number one, in order to get these products licensed is the first step. And if we get the products licensed and we endorse them and promote them, then business will pick them up and make them available to producers like myself. There's been other products in the past that have been something that would have been very advantageous to us, but they just didn't quite fit into the criteria of whether it be a feed or a pharmaceutical. And so I think that's the challenge right now, is to make sure that we have that category, and that's where government can play such a big role, is to make that category, to recognize the fact that we have an area that we can improve on, that feed additives can be part of, that can have a really great environmental impact.
So, Mr. Thompson, you would make a recommendation to the committee, right? That the government, that Agriculture Canada should make the regulatory modifications to create this category. And
Monsieur Le Sétan, Mr. Thompson, if you just want 10 seconds quickly.
Monsieur le Président, est-ce que Monsieur Thompson pourrait envoyer la réponse par écrit?
Could he send the answer by writing?
Mr. Thompson,
yes, we definitely can provide that. We would make that recommendation.
I apologize. It's the nature of the business. Mr. Juan, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I want to apologize to those who are in the room. I was looking forward to seeing you in person, but childcare issues in the morning, and I'm on deck. To the grain growers, Aaron, you've touched on a few points, and to the benefit, because we will be writing a report. When you say farmers need to be recognized, what do you mean by that?
I think what I mean by that in terms of recognition, I think is a couple of things. I think one, the direct contributions that they've made in the absence of any regulatory requirement to do that. And I think that they need to be recognized too for during that time and going forward. They know what's best on their farm in terms of the practices that will and will not work, what they can do in Western Canada versus Eastern Canada. And so they want to be a part of the conversations in terms of developing the policies and programs because they are prepared to do more. And I think their track record, and I think that's why we talk about recognition of what they've done, they have a very clear track record of significant improvements in this space. And I think they want to be a part of that conversation going forward because they have a very good sense of what's going to make sense on their individual operation.
So I'm assuming we could assume that quantifying that recognition would be a goal, and how would we quantify that recognition right now? And Mr. Thompson, you've touched on a few points. Obviously, we don't want to send government auditors on the farm to say, okay, take soil samples and carbon samples and say you've reduced your carbon by X amount. But are you aware of other technologies that are being developed so we could reduce the red tape on farmers, but to provide that recognition?
Well, as Fawn mentioned, and maybe I'll let her comment on that, but briefly, yeah, there are products, and one that was tried to get registered a while back was a product that would make grazing legumes, which cause bloat, safe. And so the more vegetation we can grow, the more carbon we're sequestrating. But if producers are worried about grazing vegetation that harms the animals, then they're not going to do it. And so we have an opportunity there. And Fawn, maybe you could comment on the other product, please.
Yeah, I think what I would say is that while we can work on the really fine details, I think that we really need to work at the big puzzle pieces. And for us, we're losing grasslands at a rate that is, having huge implications. And so, our thought is that to really come up with a land use plan to figure out how to turn that trend around. And we know the first tool that we could do is balancing the business risk management programs. And then I think, we can think about easements, term easements. We could think about perennial forage programs. We could think about, other tools. But I think we really have to think at the big scale if we're going to reach our 2030 goal, which is to keep grasslands in grasslands. And if I'm being honest, that's the goal that we have the most challenge with, and we need the most help from government for.
So yeah, and land use planning, as you know, is mostly dealt. I mean, all dealt at the provincial level. And is the provinces engaged on that? Are you having more success with certain provinces than other provinces? And how would you, knowing that the land use planning is it's all done provincially, but how would you see the role of the federal government play in there?
Yeah, and I think we really need all the different stakeholders at the table, because how different policies interact actually drive those land use changes, right? So when we have a federal policy on biofuels, for example, well, what is the implication of that? Or if we have sectors that don't have equal access to BRM or production neutral BRM, then what are the implications there? And so our ask is to get all of those different stakeholders, because as you've very rightly indicated, the provinces have a really big role in that. And we talk a lot about grassland conversion, but I think we need to really look at it from an agriculture loss perspective, right? We lost, I think, 1.4 million acres of grassland of agriculture land in the last census. So, these are serious problems when we're thinking of environmental deliverables and world food security right now.
Great, thank you. I think I'm out of time in about 10 seconds, but I just want to say thanks to all of the witnesses. I know your sector has played a vital role. We do have some differences. We are working on those differences, and I think that we have a lot more that unites us than divides us. And I know that your sector continues to do a great job. Merci beaucoup. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Joanne. We'll go right now to Mr. Perron. 2 minutes 30 seconds, s'il vous plaît.
2.5 minutes. Yes. So let's will end our roundtable, Mrs. Gawryluk, if you're in agreement with this. So your vision on decentralization that is required, and also the fact that sums must be made available to producers.
Certainly, I think we would support that vision as reflected in our commitment to the Road to 2050. This roadmap that we're looking to develop, it's been done before. I think it would look very similar in its approach to the one that was developed by farmers in the United Kingdom. And that is to provide concrete recommendations that are developed by farmers, providing government with clear direction of A, where greater potential exists, so where Canadian farmers know they can do more, and B, what are some of the barriers to uptake? So why don't we see more Canadian farmers, Western Canadian farmers, for example, practicing cover cropping? What can we do to incentivize that practice? Is there greater investment in research required, for example? So providing government with that direction in terms of where funds, policies, and programs should be directed is the intention of the roadmap ultimately, and having farmers be at the center of that conversation.
Merci.
Thank you very much. Mrs. Jackson, you spoke about the preservation of grassland, the loss of agricultural land. If we found a way of measuring performance of land, do you think that we'll have to go to each land separately, or could we, to measure this, or by keeping the spirit of what we're trying to do, could you look at X type of soil in X type of region, and what is the performance with regards to carbon? I'd like to hear you speak to this.
Yeah, I really think that we can keep it at a higher level, because I think that that's where we're going to be able to really drive the amount of change that we need. And then I think as we get into these sort of finer details of perhaps you want to supply a habitat for a specific species, or perhaps you want to increase, wetland retention in one specific area, I think that that's when you can get down to those smaller details. So perhaps working on the infrastructure that can support that, such as having the certified sustainable beef program, which 17% of our beef producers are under now. Those are the types of tools that would be able to, really hone in on some of the very specific details. But, I think going back to that sort of land loss, I really think that keeping it at a high level is going to be very important for the short-term solutions that we need. That Nature United paper said by 2030, we need to stop land conversion, right?
Thank you, Ms. Jackson. Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Perron.
Thank you, Mr. Perron. Now, Mr. McGregor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just waiting for my microphone to come on. Ms. Gawryluk, I'd like to ask you, just, on Bill C-234, I think the discussions are going to be very similar with what we had in the previous Parliament with Bill C-206. And I remember when that bill was before committee, we had witnesses like the, people who were involved in the technology, and they said that anything to replace propane and natural gas was probably at least 10 years off to be commercially viable. But we did also have a witness who appeared for this current study who warned our committee against systems that may take leftover plant residue, crop residue off the fields to use that as a fuel source, because she said that is very important for increasing the carbon in the soil. So, no matter which way you look at it, there's a trade-off. I guess, from your members' perspectives, have any of your members started using alternative systems? Do they want to see the federal government put more research into this? Because I know, even with natural gas prices, with or without the carbon tax, it can still be a very volatile fuel source on international markets. And so that stability won't always be there as much as farmers would like. Any comments you have on that, please?
Absolutely. Thank you very much for the question. I think, as outlined in my initial comments when we had an opportunity to survey our members in preparation for today's appearance, it's really all about efficiency, and it's about cost savings. And many of the practices that they've adopted make good environmental sense, but they just make good business sense. And so if you have an alternative to natural gas and propane, which is increasingly expensive, farmers would look to adopt that, but it has to offer cost savings. It has to be efficient. And to your question with respect to whether or not many of our farmers, or any of our farmers who dry grain, are currently using an alternative to natural gas and propane, the answer would be no. It simply doesn't exist yet, and I think that's why you see sector-wide support even beyond grain growers for Bill C-2, 3, 4, because we recognize that it's not going to achieve its policy intent, which is to encourage a practice change and to Canadian farmers to use alternative fuel sources, which are simply not available right now for the purposes of grain drying.
Thank you, Ms. Gowrock. Thank you, Mr. McGregor. Unfortunately, that's time. And that actually concludes our first panel. Colleagues, I don't do it often, but I'm just going to ask a quick question to Mr. Thompson. I recognize you're from Saskatchewan, and I did have the privilege of being there a couple of weeks ago. I visited one of your colleagues, Scott Grenier, near Indian Head. And I was kind of, it was eye-opening, of course, when you talk about land management and some of the pressures that are on in terms of what crops to bring forward. Some farms are mixed, but we know that commodities are through the roof right now. And he talked about some of the sloughs and some of the wetlands that do exist, how there's an inherent pressure to make those even more maximized from a crop perspective. The government had announced some programs around wetland preservation. We know there's been partnerships with Ducks Unlimited. Can you speak to whether or not those programs are landing for farmers, whether it be cattle farmers like yourself or perhaps crop farmers? Are those programs working, and how can we expedite them, particularly with some of the pressures that are being faced on preserving those wetlands and grasslands?
There's a significant pressure on conversion of any possible acre that can grow the high value annual crops that are being produced right now. Farming, as a couple of previous speakers have mentioned, is such a high stakes game now. The amount of money in and out is immense. And so when a producer sees land that could potentially turn a few more dollars into his net return, they're really motivated to make the most of it. So I think it really is important that we encourage some of that land and most of that, a good bit of that land is better left in wetlands and left in habitat. And so if policy can be drafted and a lot of consideration made to make it not, to say, okay, you could make it a couple of acres, but it's worth this to stay in wetlands or to stay in grasslands, because you drive around Western Canada and there's a tremendous number of acres that should not be farmed. It should be converted back to a perennial cover program, as Fawn mentioned. And so I think that's really important that we think about that. And I would suggest it could be in the millions of acres that could be promoted to be that kind of cover.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Thompson. Thank you, colleagues, for the brief indulgence. And thank you to our witnesses, Ms. Miller, Ms. Gowrock, and Mr. Thompson and Ms. Jackson. Thank you for your time today. Colleagues, we're going to take just a very brief moment to get our new witnesses in, and then we're going to get right to it so that we can try to get some time for questions. Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Chair, 1 minute.
Okay.
Un, deux, trois, quatre.
Colleagues, welcome back. Thank you, Madam Clerk, for the quick changeover with our witnesses. And we're going to get right to opening statements so we can get to questions, particularly with the impending vote. So today, I'm pleased to be able to welcome Eric Tonesmeyer, who is the Director of Perennial Agriculture Institute, I believe connected with Yale University, although it's not with my notes. Dr. Rod McCrae, who serves as at the Faculty of Environmental and Urban Change at York University, and Mr. Ryan Cullen, who is a small-scale and urban agriculture entrepreneur at City of Greens Farm. Each of you are going to have 5 minutes for opening remarks, so we'll get right to that. Mr. Tonesmeyer, I'm going to start with you for 5 minutes.
Splendid. Thank you, honorable members. I hope today to share my experience as a former senior fellow for Project Drawdown and researcher on agricultural climate change mitigation. My knowledge relates to the science and practices rather than policy. That part I will leave to you. Climate change is kind of like an overflowing kitchen sink. Emissions are the water flowing from the faucet, which is now pouring onto the floor. The first thing to do is turn off the faucet. That's reducing emissions. Turn off the faucet. The next thing is to mop up the wet floor. This is carbon sequestration. Both are necessary and neither is enough alone. In the area of agriculture, we have several approaches to mitigation. The first is demand reduction. For example, reducing food waste and shifting diets to foods with low emissions and low land demand, although food can have positive or negative effects depending on how it's produced. Next is to reduce emissions from agricultural production itself. Third is to remove excess carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and store it in soils and biomass, a process called carbon sequestration. Increasing productivity on the farmland we have can help to reduce deforestation pressure elsewhere, a process called sustainable intensification. And finally, the supply chain is a significant source of emissions, including transport, processing, retail, and more. Each of these approaches is important, and together they can have a powerful impact. According to FAO, Canada's top 5 sources of agricultural emissions are land conversion, farming on peat soils, on-farm energy use, enteric fermentation from the digestion of cattle and other ruminant livestock, and synthetic fertilizers. Canada has a powerful toolkit of mitigation practices to draw on. I love seeing the Agricultural Climate Solutions Grants Program, which targets cover crops, nutrient management, shelter belts, and rotational grazing. These are all excellent priorities. A number of additional tools are available to address your key emission sources, like limiting land conversion, rewetting peatland soils, on-farm energy conservation, and using forages with high tannin levels to reduce methane. Returning sovereignty of forest land to Indigenous people is also a powerful tool for protecting forest carbon. When it comes to carbon sequestration, it's important to note that some practices have a much higher per acre impact than others. They're not all equal. Generally speaking, the more trees, the more carbon, and this is why agroforestry practices, which integrate trees with crops or livestock, are especially powerful. Carbon sequestration has other limits as well. It does slow down dramatically after several decades, and the carbon which is held can be re-released by climate disasters or a return to the previous farming practices. To come back to the notion of the overflowing sink, the bucket for the mop is only so large and it can be knocked over. So carbon sequestration is essential, but isn't the only approach we should take. While many emission reduction practices are new and were created only for mitigation, that's not true for carbon sequestration. These practices were developed because they're good for the farm and or the surrounding environment. And they offer many co-benefits like climate change adaptation, which is critical because while no farm on its own can mitigate all of climate change, every farm must be resilient to the new conditions in which they're farming. And Canadian farmers are facing increased rainfall intensity, which exacerbates erosion. And many of these carbon sequestration practices reduce erosion. All of them improve soil organic matter, which greatly enhances soil water holding capacity for drought resilience, among other benefits. And the proposed private members bill C-203, an act respecting soil conservation and soil health, would create a national strategy to greatly accelerate adoption of practices that sequester soil carbon and assist farmers to adapt to our changing climate. Thanks once again, and I welcome the opportunity to answer any questions.
Thank you very much. We'll now move to Mr. McRae for up to 5 minutes. Over to you.
Thanks very much for the opportunity to appear before you today. I urge the committee to examine how to improve our policy execution. We have an implementation problem in the Canadian food and agriculture system as it relates to environmental improvement. It's a decades-old problem. It cuts across all levels of government, all governing parties, and elected and unelected officials and their systems. Nobody seems to want to address it, and I'm hoping you will. Given what's in play and the potential of Canadian agriculture to contribute to environmental sustainability, this seems to be a moment for change. Now, we do have many good aspirations and policy statements, and in some cases we have very good targets, but the instruments that we're using will not permit us to meet the sustainability goals we've set out for the food and agriculture sector. All the main programs for environmental sustainability in agriculture suffer from the same kinds of deficiencies, and this includes the Canadian Agricultural Partnerships, the On-Farm Climate Change Fund, Climate Change Solutions. And these problems are essentially that they're largely voluntary. They focus on grants or contribution agreements. They're not targeted. They focus on best management practices and not systems change. They focus on the supply side without demand side elements. And they have limited transition planning associated with them. So these instruments are not adequate for the scale of our challenges. We have to improve our instrument choices, our designs, our application, and our integration. I elaborate on more suitable designs on my research website, and the clerk has the link to that site. So thanks for inviting me again, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Mr. McRae. We'll now move to Mr. Cullen for up to 5 minutes for opening remarks.
Good day, and thank you for the opportunity to speak today. My name is Ryan Cullen. So I manage a small-scale, in our case, 10-acre diversified farm. We predominantly grow market garden vegetables intensively, but are integrating small-scale livestock systems, small fruit and nut tree systems in a rural peri-urban context. I've also designed and managed a small-scale, high-tech, high-yield urban farm in an academic setting at our local college, while also learning and training from some of the leading small-scale and regenerative farmers around the world. I'm focused on demonstrating the viability of small-scale regenerative agriculture farms, teaching and training new generation of farmers and growers, and redefining the paradigms in horticulture, food, and farming and how they connect to our everyday life. Regardless of the context of any of these farms, I want to stress the importance of how some of them are being managed. On our farm, we plan and manage our farm holistically, following regenerative farming principles, meaning we consider how our resource base, our decisions, our production systems, and outcomes not only affect our bottom line, but also positively affect our environment and the people in our community. Regenerative agriculture is all about managing holistically. So we make decisions that are not just based on economics, but include the social and environmental impacts and outcomes as well. Building soil, as we've heard through many of the speakers today, is an important part as well. It has the power to sequester carbon, cycle nutrients, and produce life. And we focus on systems that improve soil health, not destroy it, whether it be no-till, cover crop systems, not spraying herbicide and pesticides, and using organic inputs. We try to mimic ecosystem processes, understanding how nature functions in wholes, recognizing that natural laws and patterns in nature, and how we can use nature to create a niche for our production systems and our economies. Integrating these laws and patterns and systems into our production systems and our everyday farm business. We strive to use local inputs for local outputs, capitalizing on circular economies, using wastes, particularly our own, as resources, integrating our systems so that the inputs for the farm come from the farm. We focus on mobile, scalable infrastructure that's low-tech, innovative, energy efficient, and useful technology applied with low capital costs and minimal fossil fuel use. We're investing in management and information, not expensive infrastructure with high capital costs. Our model's direct to consumer, sales, and certified by our customers. We very much meet and exceed organic standards, but don't believe we should have to pay for certification to demonstrate we have safe and high quality products. Transparency about what we do and how we do it by inviting the public and our customers to be part of the experience, to see how their food's grown, to understand how we do it, and educate people on where their food is coming from. Trying to put the farm at the center of the community and an integral part of the social fabric. We're ecologically, socially, and economically regenerative. We're attempting to build up multiple forms of capital, not just economic forms. We're trying to create a resource base in harmony with nature, society, and ourselves that's sustainable, viable, and resilient. If farms are going to be regenerative, we need to work to a triple bottom line. That works to keep our business, the regeneration of the land, and our customer satisfaction in equal consideration. What we need in agriculture are production systems at various scales, fit to their context, whether it's 1,000 acres in Saskatchewan or a quarter acre in the city. We need integrated systems that permeate the social fabric of our lives, that produce high quality food for people and grow locally with local labor, accessible and convenient to the local population, that regenerate our landscape, cities and countryside, and are integrated into our communities, economies, and environments we're living in today. Production systems that are viable agricultural models and use useful technologies already exist and are being practiced. We need to promote these systems and models and promote local inputs and outputs, create local jobs from a skilled local workforce, and integrate these systems to our local communities and economies. We need to take a holistic approach that is regenerative, and that's what we're trying to do. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Cullen. Just for the benefit of our witnesses, we are expecting a procedural vote in the House where our bells may start at about 12:30 Eastern. We have permission to go for about another 15 minutes after the bells happen. So we should be able to get one full round of questions in just for the benefit of our colleagues. If folks want to share time, that is your prerogative. But we're now going to start with the Conservatives. I believe it's Mr. Falk is up first. Over to you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our witnesses for your presentations this morning. They were very interesting. And we'll try and glean a little bit more information out of there. Also, I'd like to start with Mr. Townsmeyer. You talked about increasing productivity. Do you have any specific examples of how a person could do that?
Well, one of the interesting things about that category is there are perhaps hundreds of different ways of doing it, from a very conventional approach of increasing fertilizer use and integrated pest management and so on, to the integration of trees with crops so that you can produce timber and crops on the same land, and in 100 acres produce what would take 130 or 140 acres to produce separately. So there are lots of different ways to do that.
Okay, I want to get back to a comment you just made about increasing fertilizer. Part of this government's objective when it comes to agriculture is reducing fertilizer input by 30%. And yet they've also indicated in this last budget that they want to increase our agriculture exports from $55 billion to $85 billion annually. Is that a doable aspiration?
I would suspect that would bring some challenges with it, yes. And I'll say that in terms of increasing fertilizer use, that refers more to areas where it is underutilized, which is not the case in most of North America. I do work globally, so I may have implied something incorrectly there.
Okay. You also talked about shifting food demand. Can you just extrapolate a little bit more what you mean by that?
Certainly. Well, it's clear that some foods tend to have much higher emissions than others, both directly from their production and also by using more land than other crops. So if you can shift diets to some degree to some of those lower emission foods, that can reduce emissions from agriculture. That's sort of a demand side approach, which the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is getting more excited about, for example, and does seem like a really important component of the whole thing. You may do that through just changing what kind of food is served in schools. Would be one possible approach to doing that.
Okay, good. Thank you. Mr. Cullen, I'd like to ask you also a few questions. You farm 10 acres. You say you supply the local market. What do you mean by local?
So for us, we're very much concentrated just outside of an urban center. So if you're familiar with Durham Region, Oshawa, Whitby, Ajax, Pickering, and we have a 10-acre farm with almost an acre market garden, and we're able to feed 150 to 200 families a week. We sell our products at local farmers markets within the city. We have local partnerships with local businesses that allow us to get direct to our consumer. We invite people to the farm in our local community to see what we're doing, to learn how we're growing, and to buy products off us right off the farm. So we're very much connected in a direct to consumer relationship.
Okay, and so you're saying your farm would entirely supply 150 to 200 families food requirements for a week?
Not entirely. So currently we're growing vegetables. So we specialize in salad greens and market garden vegetables. We have eggs as well, but we currently don't grow any livestock. So no meat or dairy or anything like that coming off our farm. But on a weekly basis, yes, supply of vegetables, farm fresh eggs, honey, things like that.
Okay. And do you have a way of sustaining these products through winter?
Currently not right now because we haven't put any greenhouses up, but that is in our plan. So, extending the growing season by having low cost greenhouse systems that don't require a lot of heat through the winter. We're able to, yes, we are able to do that. We're just working towards that right now.
Okay, very good. And you also, you mentioned a lot of regenerative farming. Mm-hmm. Can you give me one example of how you are like what you're actually doing from a regeneration perspective?
Yeah, so we've taken what was essentially an acre of grass or lawn that had to be mowed or cut, and we've built a bio-intensive market garden on it. So we've added, we don't till up the soil. We add high quality compost. We grow cover crops in between annual crops. So these cover crops help build up the soil while also providing nutrients and soil life that help grow our annual vegetable crops. We really focus on harvesting and cycling nutrients on site. So we catch and store all our own water in ponds and diversion systems, and then use those inputs to irrigate our farm as well. We're integrating chickens and laying hens right now, using the outputs from them to generate our own compost and develop our own compost, so we can not have to be dependent on buying it in from outside sources.
Okay, very good. Mr. Chair, I think I'm out of time, or
you've got 10 seconds, but thank you for being on time, and thank you for your line of questioning. Mr. Turnbull, over to you.
Well, thanks to all our witnesses for being here today. It's really great, and especially want to say kudos to Ryan Cullen for being here, who's a local Durham Region resident and food champion in our local community. Ryan, I'm going to start with you, or Mr. Cullen, I'll call you for this panel. In terms of small-scale biointensive farming using, as you said, holistic and regenerative methods, I think you said in your opening remarks that a small-scale farm using those methods is highly viable. Am I correct in hearing you say that?
Yes, absolutely. On a just to throw some numbers out there, on a 1 acre market garden, we should be able to produce enough food for 50 to 100 people, and economically we can generate over $100,000 worth of annual vegetable crops with 40 to 60% margins depending on the skill of the grower, and costs of inputs and things like that. So yes, they are viable, and we make a good living, and employ a small number of people just on our scale.
Thank you. And in terms of seasonal extension, I know that previously I'd talked to you and you had shown me a greenhouse that was running on geothermal. So I know that greenhouses are challenging to keep going and are costly in terms of the inputs. But if we use renewable energy, was that greenhouse successful from your perspective?
Yes, very much. So we built a passive solar greenhouse using a standard off-the-shelf, Harnois style greenhouse, and we started growing in the dead of winter, and we were able to successfully maintain temperatures above 0 degrees by storing all the heat into the soil using heat pumps and geothermal under the soil as a big heat source and sink, and so we were able to weekly grow salad greens in there throughout the winter. And I think, going forward, this is really where, especially in Canada in our cold climate, we need to focus some of our innovation and technology. How can we grow crops year round that we otherwise aren't growing now, and we can be less dependent on imports with very basic, simple technology and greenhouse systems that already exist, and applying other technology like geothermal and HVAC systems from other industries and coupling them with greenhouses so we can grow year round and have that viability.
Thanks, Mr. Cullen. Mr. McCrae, or Professor McCrae, I'm going to go to you now. In terms of, I noticed on your website you talked about the need to move from more what you call efficiency stage strategies to substitution and redesign stage strategies. Could you describe what you mean by that?
Yeah, there's a transition framework that usually has to be applied to any kind of change process, and part of our challenge is that we often don't use transition thinking. And so the idea here is that we start with relatively straightforward changes that improve the efficiency of processes, broadly speaking, the efficiency of them. But that's really just the first stage, because really what we have to do in the longer term is start to substitute certain kinds of processes and practices for ones that aren't working very well. And then the third stage, the redesign stage, is where we're really taking a lot of ecological ideas, and our colleagues on the panel, my colleagues have spoken to some of these dimensions. We're using those ecological principles and practices to redesign the way our various systems are working. So it's really a three-stage process. Obviously, the substitution stage is more complex, takes longer to implement, redesign more again. But if we're thinking in transition terms from the very beginning, then it's easier to imagine how things might unfold in a reasonably evolutionary way without too much disruption.
Okay, thank you, Mr. McCrae. If climate change can indeed be fought on the farm, which I think we're hearing from Mr. Cullen certainly is the case, what are the biggest changes to policy, Mr. McCrae, that are needed in order for us to incentivize the right types of behavior on the farm?
Well, I think we need to have transition advisory services all across the country. Now, obviously, the provinces have a big role to play in this, but because of the Canadian agricultural partnerships, there's an opportunity for the federal government, especially at this stage in negotiations, to be promoting and helping to fund these transition advisory services. They worked very effectively in Europe. So that's a key piece. I think the sustainable diet scenario that my colleague on the panel has mentioned is also very important. So in other words, farmers want to be producing things that consumers will want to eat. And if consumers are asking for things that fit into a sustainable diet scenario, that will obviously be a market-based kind of incentive. Another thing that I think is going to be very important down the road and has also been used very effectively in other jurisdictions is transition payments, because for a lot of growers, the transition period is the most financially risky. And so to help finance that transition phase while they're taking advantage of these transition advisory services, I think is another key dimension of the process.
Mr. Chair, how much time do I have?
45 seconds.
Wonderful. In terms of Mr. McCrae, I know you also on your website talk about the importance of soil organic matter and probably the need to replace some of the nitrogen-based fertilizers or gradually transition off of those in a way that makes sense for the agricultural industry. Do you have any ideas about how we could embed that in policy?
Well, a lot of the problem right now is our program designs, as I mentioned off the top, are not really based on systems adoption. So, you have, for example, Mr. Cullen's kind of system. We don't really incentivize that kind of transition process. And there are many ways in which we can do it. There can be direct payments. We can use different kinds of tax-based incentives. Some of them, of course, will be administered at other levels of government, which is why there's this key requirement for better policy integration. But there are many instruments out there that can be used to create those kinds of incentives.
Thank you, Mr. McCrae. I apologize, we're at time. Thank you, Mr. Turnbull. Maintenant, Monsieur Perron.
Now, Mr. Perron, 6 minutes. Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you to the witnesses for being with us today. I think your testimony is very important. Mr. McCrae, I'd like to follow along with the line of questioning that you've already started. You said there aren't enough incentives and that it's important to have this transition over the long term and to maintain incentives for that transition over the long term. If we were to compensate every single innovation on farms with money that would be made available to the farmers directly, then theoretically they should be able to make future innovations. And that way we would see a constant chain of innovation. Do you think that's a good model?
Yes, I do think it's a good model. Part of the idea with transition payments is that it's not a long-term process. It's usually transition payments within a 3-year window, and sometimes those payments can be reduced over time. And the idea with transition payments is not to completely substitute for what the market can provide to farmers. It's more to take away some of the riskiest elements of the transition process. And then once through the transition, many farmers are in a much better position to take advantage of those market opportunities.
OK. Donc, est-ce que vous feriez une recommandation?
So would you recommend to the committee that those payments should be decentralized rather than coming from centralized programs so that farmers can benefit from those payments in the longer term and then reinvest it and get their innovations recognized? So do you think that that would be a good model?
Well, it's very important that transition payments be associated with certain kinds of recognized sustainability protocols, and that those protocols be authenticated. And so that creates the kind of market confidence that consumers will often need. And so if you get this integrated approach where the farmer is getting transition advice from these transition advisory services, which would probably have to be provincially focused given jurisdictional requirements, and there are payments, and the payments could be coming from multiple sources. I mean, we already have, the Canadian Agricultural Partnerships model, which is an FPT model. So you can have the money coming from different places. And then if the farmers are themselves certified and can then identify their products in the marketplace, then that strikes me as a very strong integrated package.
Mr. Tonsmeyer, I'd like to hear you on this as well.
Well, it's an interesting question. It seems to me that that there aren't any one-size-fits-all practices. I don't think it would be appropriate to mandate that all farmers must implement a particular practice because each piece of land is a bit different and each farmer's needs and their markets and so on are different as well. So I suspect that in crafting policy, it would be important to leave the flexibility for the farmer to play a key role in determining which practices are right for them and for their land. That's what I think. And also, there may be sort of a ladder where you might begin with a practice like cover cropping and then step up to adding shelter belts and continuing to add additional practices over time. And it would be useful to build in a mechanism that allows farmers to continue to ratchet up their climate impact in that fashion.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. I'd like to hear Mr. Cullen on the same question, please.
Yeah, thank you. So I think any kind of incentives we can offer to farmers, as Mr. Townsmeyer said as well, every farm is different. Every context, I think, is different. And I think if there's a general set of practices that can be outlined in a framework from within which to operate, then I think farmers like myself can identify certain practices and be contributing certain practices and then being rewarded for them. I think what's important too is some sort of green tape cutting, where it makes it easier for farmers like ourselves to erect greenhouses in certain municipalities or use different types of innovations and infrastructure that might not otherwise be recognized, and allow it to be more easily implemented without the costs of permits and regulations and things like that, and giving farmers and more creativity and more opportunities in different contexts, especially someone like myself who farms urban and paleo.
Thank you. Mr. Cullen, I'm sorry to cut you off. I just wanted to ask you a last question because I don't have much time. I think I got your point that you do want it to be relatively decentralized. My last question, you talked about organic production. You don't understand why you have to pay to get that organic certification. So I'd like to hear you just talk about that and the financial aspect of the organic certification that's managed by the federal government. What do you think of that?
Sure. So as I said before, I think we're certified by our customers. We're very transparent in how we grow. We demonstrate we grow organically. I don't feel like there needs to be a certifying body or regulating body that tells me or us farmers how we can grow our best products. I think we're certified by our customers. We're transparent about how we grow. They can come to the farm and see that we don't spray pesticides, that we grow organic soils, we use organic inputs, how our farm is run, and it's up to the consumer to decide and make that decision. And I think the costs and the time associated with getting organic certified it doesn't make a lot of sense, and especially at certain scales.
Thank you, Mr. Cullen. Thank you, Mr. Perron. Maintenant, Monsieur McGregor.
Great. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And again, repeating my colleagues, thank you to all of our witnesses for aiding us in this study. Mr. Townsmeyer, I'd like to start with you. I actually really appreciated your sink analogy with respect to climate change. The faucet and also the spillover on the floor. And if I think we acknowledge that, agriculture's probably their greatest role is in acting as a mop, in trying to sequester that excess carbon that we've put into the atmosphere. And I appreciate the shout out to my bill C203. I really took a lot of inspiration from what Australia is doing, and the fact that they have older soils there generally that are not very high in carbon content, and they are losing billions of dollars worth of farm production every year due to erosion. So I think it was turning into a real national crisis there. And I also like how they are going to establish the office of a soils advocate, someone who can be in a position to really keep pressure on the government and act as a sort of a nexus for public opinion, but also for stakeholder relations to really continue to push those policies. You've authored a book called The Carbon Farming Solution, and I've read that book. I've seen many of the examples from what other countries are doing. With respect to agroforestry and all of the examples that you've sort of included in that book, for the benefit of our committee, I was wondering if you could talk about what other countries, apart from Australia, what are some of the notable countries that are really putting these practices into amazing effect that perhaps we could study and learn from?
Sure. The first one would be France, who have really been leading the way on research and development in agroforestry and have a national commitment to convert 1.5 million acres of cropland to agroforestry over the next decade or two. Another outstanding example until recently was Brazil, where all of the public schools were required to buy at least 30% of their food from farms that were part of an agroforestry and sustainable production method. I really appreciate what's being done in Mexico, where ranchers who have been subsidized by the federal government because they're not producing efficiently, profitably, have been provided finance to convert to a silvopasture system where they integrate trees, which greatly intensifies production there. They have 2 to 10 times a higher stocking rate in these intensive silvopasture systems and lower emissions and higher carbon sequestration, after which the farmers don't need subsidies anymore because they've become more profitable. So those would be a few examples. And Australia as well. There's much to be learned from the efforts that have happened there. One of my favorite things is that they're addressing savanna burning by changing the time of year in which savannas are burned, and actually rewarding and recognizing and appreciating and financing the indigenous communities there who used to manage much of Australia with fire in that fashion. And bringing them into their carbon payment scheme. So I think Australia is a great model for Canada in many ways.
Thank you, and I'm sure you're aware that the federal government has committed to an initiative to plant 2 billion trees, and in a previous life I was a tree planter, so I know the work that's going to be involved getting that up to speed. But would you like to see like a significant portion of that tree planting initiative focused more on agricultural, like trees that can be used either for fuel, for fiber, or crops? Would you like to see a significant portion of that program devoted towards agriculture specifically?
Personally, I would. The carbon sequestration rates on farms that have trees integrated in them are 3 to 5 times higher than those in the improved cropping and improved grazing systems alone. So where it makes sense to do that, where it actually can improve profitability and productivity, it does make sense to do that from a carbon perspective. There's also a significant nitrous oxide reduction from integrating trees on farms. The roots capture capture fertilizer, which would otherwise leach away and off-gas as nitrous oxide. So yes, I would strongly encourage you, and I would be delighted to talk with anyone there further about it at great length.
Okay, well, that sounds like a pretty solid recommendation that our committee can make in that regard. I really do appreciate that. And just on my final question, turning to City Green's farm, I really liked your intervention on regenerative farming practices. But, we heard from Professor McCrae, who was talking about incentivizing the transition to regenerative farming. I was wondering if you could just talk about, from your experience, what do you wish, looking back, might have been on offer from the federal government to help you set up your farm?
Yeah, thank you. Great question. I think there's not a lot of typically incentives in terms of funding or access to funds especially for small scale growers. A lot of the programs developed by government or accessing capital, it's typically for larger scale farms, and for the small scale grower or biointensive grower, there's not a lot of avenues and ways in which we can access funds or capital to get started. Access to land for someone like myself who doesn't traditionally come from a farming background or a farming family is also very difficult. So, the high capitalization of buying land and real estate and getting a farm going is very difficult. So if there's ways to access capital for smaller scale growers to start some of these biointensive farms, that would be Super.
Thank you, Mr. Cullen. Thank you, Mr. McGregor. Colleagues, the bells have started ringing, but as we agreed on previously, I'll let us go till about 15 minutes and then we'll release so that folks have time to vote in person. So I'm going to go to the second round, but we're going to keep it to 4 minutes for both the Conservatives and Liberals and 2 minutes for the Bloc and NDP. So I think it might be Mr. Epp for 4 minutes if you'd like to have additional time.
Yes, I'd like to begin with the Whitby farm, with the Durham farm. What would you define as being local?
For us, I think it's your immediate community. So in Durham region, if you're familiar, there's Oshawa, Whitby, Ajax, Pickering, and I think for us that's local. So depending where we are in our municipality, we try to serve our community within our region. There's a few million people, and our small farm on 10 acres can only really serve 150 of those. So what we need is more small scale farms in our context, so we can serve more people and make farming kind of the center of the community. I'd like to see more farms that are urban, peri-urban, and kind of integrating the rural traditional agriculture with more urban, small-scale, bio-intensive farms right in the city, so people can, instead of driving to Costco and big box superstores, they can get access to local produce from local farms, and it's right on their doorstep.
Thank you. I'll just ask for your quick comment. Then I flew in this morning. I brought peppers and some cucumbers that I sourced a kilometer up the road in a greenhouse, grown pesticide-free in a 100-acre production facility. Am I eating locally tonight?
Yes, I would say you are, and congratulations on that effort.
Thank you. To Mr. McRae, can you give me your assessment of Canada's regulatory framework? How responsive is it? I guess I'm looking forward to some technologies that hold a lot of promise, like gene editing. We heard from that from the previous panel this morning. Can I have your comments on, the state of our regulatory system and its ability to quickly adopt technologies that has so much promise environmentally?
Well, I think our regulatory system still suffers from its roots, if you will. I mean, a lot of our regulations were designed around fraud prevention. And obviously, fraud prevention is important. But now we're in a situation where, as you say, we're trying to figure out how to support certain kinds of transitions towards sustainability, whether they're management related or technology related. And I would say that our regulatory apparatus, as I've highlighted as well with much of our program instruments, are not yet up to the challenge of helping us move rapidly in this direction.
So what's needed?
Well, that's what my website is all about. I've got hundreds of proposals on how we need to change all kinds of government instruments at all levels of government. So I'd encourage you to look at my proposals there.
Thank you. Would you support a very regionalized approach to implementation of many of the strategies that you've outlined because of the diversity in our agricultural sector?
Well, yes, obviously part of our dilemma is that we focused for too long on export and not enough on regionalization, and also we haven't done much in the realm of import substitution. So those are critical areas that need much more attention.
Thank you. To the Perennial Agricultural Institute, into a perennialized system, how do vegetables fit in?
Actually, there are many perennial vegetables. I've written several books about them. And many of them are extremely high in the nutrients that people have the greatest deficiencies in countries like Canada.
My farm name is Lycoland Farms Limited, coming from Lycopersicon esculentum, so from a tomato perspective. So how would you integrate into that industry? How would you integrate that into your philosophy?
Sure. Well, the tomato is not easily perennialized at this point. We don't have a good substitute. Annuals are great, and we should grow the things that are annual and grow them well, but we can supplement with many other perennial vegetables. The great advantage to be perennial vegetables in cold climates is that they're yielding in much earlier in the spring. So I've been eating them here in Massachusetts for a month already. So they have a seasonality which is much earlier than the annual crop. So they extend the growing season in a fashion that I find is very complementary compared to annual vegetables like tomatoes, which I do appreciate and grow, by the way.
Thank you, Mr. Tonesmeyer. Thank you, Mr. Epp. Mr. Epp, I gave you wine. I guess I'm looking for a basket of tomatoes at some point, but I'll hold you to that. Ms. Valdez, 4 minutes.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to our witnesses for being a part of this important study. And I love tomatoes, just saying. So, Dr. McCrae, your research is focused on creating a national food policy for Canada. So I just wanted to give you the opportunity to elaborate on that policy and what your vision is for Canada.
Well, I'm quite comfortable with the food policy, the national food policy that's been put forward by the current government in 2019. I think, again, the issue is not the visions and the principles, it's the implementation. So a lot of what's in play and what's being proposed to reach the vision, I don't think will get us there. And I have similar observations on what's happening in a lot of the provinces as well. So my vision is not all that different. I mean, it's more elaborated perhaps on the ecological side, but what's critically important, as I say, is the redesign of a lot of the instruments we're putting forward to reach those visions.
Thank you. And can you just touch on, you spoke on a few challenges that farmers face already, but what, in your opinion, is our greatest opportunity for us to address in this committee?
Well, the farm sector, you know, when you look at the studies on why farmers don't make changes, why they don't shift to more sustainable practices, they name about 15 different barriers. We think that they're mostly financial, and obviously some of them are financial, but there are also many what are called psychosocial barriers. One's status in the community, how one relates to other institutions, how one's banker interprets what one is doing. All these kinds of psychosocial dimensions can be very significant. So part of the challenge for us now is to, when we think about if we're going to implement changes that involve supporting the transition period, it's not just about providing money, but also ensuring that this takes place in a way that addresses these psychosocial barriers.
Thank you. And so for Mr. Cullen, could you tell us how you started, City of Green Farms, and what environmental techniques you feel can be really leveraged across the country?
Sure, thank you. So as I mentioned before, I don't come from a farming background. I grew up in the city, but I was traveling the world and working in Thailand on a number of permaculture projects. And actually, Mr. Tonesmeyer's book, Edible Forest Gardens, was a big inspiration in my life. And so I started out of general interest, and I took my teaching skills and went back to college. And one of my biggest platforms for starting my farm was we had a great horticulture, food, and farming program at our local college. And I think if we have more institutions like that, with developing and teaching and training people like myself who can get into this field with the proper skill set, that's a big thing, and I would certainly champion that. And for your second question, we very much focus on cover crops, soil building, cycling nutrients on our farm, catching and storing water and reusing it, creating our own inputs from our own wastes, feeding our chickens excess produce from the gardens, integrating livestock systems into our soil generation. As I said, catching and storing nutrients as much as we can, and trying to mimic nature, mimicking forest ecosystems and applying them in our annual and perennial production systems. That's what we do.
Thank you. And we've talked a lot about incentives. What incentives do you think that farmers, especially small-scale farmers, could really use or be incentivized to be able to continue to produce sustainable technologies?
In about 20 seconds, please.
Sure. For us, I think it's consumer awareness. I just want to sell more to more local people, and the more we can change consumer demand and change consumer perspectives, I think that goes a long way to the viability of small-scale farms like ourselves.
Thank you very much, Mr. Cullen, Ms. Valdez. Maintenant, Monsieur Perron, 2 minutes.
2 minutes, Mr. Perron. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Tonesmeyer, I would like to come back to you. You mentioned in your introduction earlier that carbon reduction sometimes can be over the shorter term, and there's a danger if a soil cultivation changes in the future and the carbon can leach. So this financial support program has to be quite permanent. Could you add to this?
It's necessary if you're building your national strategy around carbon in soils or in trees, for that matter, to put measures in place that make sure that it will stay there. Otherwise, it will be re-emitted again, or it can be re-emitted again. So that's a critical concern that people are thinking about around the world with carbon sequestration and national plans. And also to think about how you want to handle if something happens that's outside of the farmer's control, like a fire or an extended multi-year drought, a shift to a drier climate, which will mean the loss of some of that soil carbon. These are important things to build in. I don't particularly have the answers to how that might be done, but it would certainly be something to take into account that it's somewhat vulnerable.
Without being very specific, would you recommend to the committee to recommend to the government to not go forward with programs that are too restrictive, but rather to have a model that would be as decentralized as possible so that agricultural producers can take decisions that are good for their farms?
I do think flexibility is essential, and mandating specific practices often might have a negative effect on a particular farm. So it does. You do need to build in some ability to meet those individuals' farms' needs. Something might work in one soil type and not in another, for example. So without creating a bureaucratic monstrosity that's a nightmare for everyone to work with, to the degree that you can build that in, it will make farmers much happier to participate.
Thank you, Mr. Tonsmeyer, Mr. Parent. Mr. McGregor, we've got about a minute before we're at 15 minutes, and I want to be respectful to our colleagues. So I might have to apologize to you, but if it's okay, perhaps we can adjourn at this point if that's okay. And
I just need a minute, Chair. Just a minute.
Go right ahead.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Tonsmeyer, I just want to give you a chance to expand on the agroforestry and building on the 2 billion trees initiative. The federal government is funding that, but given Canada's climate, I mean, what kind of crop trees would you like to see us focused on? The crop trees that hit the markers of profitability, but also are great at sequestering carbon. Can you just expand a little bit more on that in 30 seconds, please?
I'm very enthusiastic about willows and poplars, which can grow to very high latitudes in Canada for short rotation biomass systems, not particularly for energy as my focus, but they have lots of applications in the material and chemical feedstock industries where they could replace fossil-based carbon inputs in certain ways.
Thank you, Mr. McGregor. I apologize. Thank you, Mr. Tonsmeyer. We are at time, folks. We're gonna adjourn, but thank you to our witnesses, Mr. Tonsmeyer, Mr. Cullen, and Mr. McRae, for your excellent testimony here today. Colleagues, we will be back on Thursday to continue our draft consideration of the supply chain and agriculture report. So we'll see everyone on Thursday, and thank you to all of those involved.